Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in a monumental work of scholarship, the destruction of Black civilization. Great issues of a race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD by the esteemed Chancellor Williams.
We thank you for listening, and please do consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this conversation, we would absolutely encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author.
You know, it's considered by so many foundational figures in academia and activism to be the basic text necessary for African mental development.
That phrase, basic text, that's really key, isn't it? It speaks directly to his mission.
It does. It gets right to the core of what drove Williams for, 16 grueling years of research. He wasn't just, writing history for history's sake. He set out to solve what he saw as a profound historical puzzle.
And what was that puzzle exactly?
Well, the central question was this: how did Black civilization, which he demonstrates was once the world's leading people,
The pioneers in science, medicine, architecture, writing.
all of it, how did they descend from that supreme position to become effectively the lowest positioned group among the people of the world? Williams saw this historical fall as something that needed to be diagnosed, understood, and ultimately reversed.
So his intention was highly practical. It wasn't just academic theory for him.
Precisely. And that's why he deliberately wrote this book to be completely understandable by both specialized scholars and what he called the Black masses, the laborer, the housemaid, the student. He felt the message needed to get to every single level for a mental revolution to even be possible.
16 years. That is an unbelievable commitment for a single project. It speaks to a level of thoroughness that, well, you just don't see very often.
It really doesn't.
Okay, so let's get into his methodology. How did he gather the source material to cover 6,500 years of, incredibly complex and often hidden history?
His approach was incredibly disciplined and comprehensive. It was really designed to break through centuries of what he saw as historical erasure. It was two-pronged.
Okay.
First, he relied on what you'd call documentary sources. So an exhaustive review of existing records, Greek, Roman, European, American. But the real genius, I think, was in mining the unintentional sources.
Unintentional sources. What do you mean by that?
Well, he looked far beyond the traditional histories written to praise Europe. He went into colonial administrator reports, missionary letters, parliamentary debates about African trade, even records from early geographers.
So documents that weren't meant to be historical records of African life.
Exactly. They were often invaluable because they documented African institutions and social structures, but just as an incidental part of detailing European interests in, say, conquest or commerce, they were reporting on what they saw, even if they didn't really grasp its significance.
So he was piecing together a counter-narrative from the margins of the conqueror's own records. That takes a remarkable amount of work.
It does. But the second part, the field studies, is what truly sets his work apart. This is why it took so long. Williams dedicated 2 full years to working directly in Black Africa. He traveled across 26 nations and studied 105 different language groups.
And where did he focus that work? In the cities?
No, just the opposite. He deliberately focused on validating oral history in what he called the hinterland, or the bush country. He knew the westernized urban centers were already heavily influenced by colonial or Islamic narratives. By going deep into the interior, he was trying to find the uncorrupted African tradition itself.
That's fascinating. So we could take a fact mentioned in, say, a 19th century missionary's letter and then validate it against the living tradition of a secluded community.
That's the method. It builds this incredibly strong case for the legitimacy of African history. He was determined not to add anything that wasn't in the sources, and his sources were just incredibly vast and varied.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental scope and jump right into the first major issue he tackles. This is really the origin of the problem, what he identifies as the Great Deception.
Yes, the systematic, intentional effort to efface or, erase the Black man's foundational role in world history.
And he says that erasure begins with ancient Egypt.
It does. For you to really get his argument, you first have to understand the geographic and political reality he's laying out. Ancient Egypt wasn't some unique, separate nation at its beginning. It was simply the northeastern region of the larger Ethiopian empire, which the Blacks themselves called Kem, or Kemia.
Okay, let's clarify those terms. What were the boundaries of Kemia or Ethiopia in this ancient context?
Kemia essentially meant the land of the Blacks, and its power was centered around the Nile cataracts. Now, cataracts are these natural barrier stretches of rapids and waterfalls that make it hard to navigate a river.
So they acted as defensive points.
Exactly. They were defensive choke points, like great watermarks that defined the heartland of black civilization along the Nile.
And Williams states that the key, really painful historical fact is that the original black population of Egypt, or northern Ethiopia, they weren't just absorbed, they were relentlessly pushed southward.
Yes, due to unending pressure from Asian and European invaders, and this is critical, harsh geographical factors like the expanding desert.
And that physical retreat, that southward push, leads directly to the core of the intellectual deception.
It does. It leads to what he calls Caucasianization.
Caucasianization. Okay, let's break that term down for the listener.
It's the process he identifies where the conquerors, Asians and Europeans, systematically changed the racial identity of powerful figures and eventually the whole nation's recorded history. It's a strategic political classification aimed at, well, intellectual theft.
So how did that work in practice? It sounds like a kind of bureaucratic warfare.
It was incredibly rigorous and deliberate, especially in North Africa. The strategy was this. The conquerors set up a system where blacks with any amount of Caucasian blood were classified as white or coloreds.
And this was applied ferociously in Egypt.
Ferociously. Conquerors would have mulatto offspring with black women. The mother might remain enslaved, but the son was often classified as free and white, which allowed the invaders to then claim black achievements as their own.
So how did that affect the historical record of the pharaohs?
It meant that unmixed black pharaohs, the ones who ruled from the very first dynasty, were often carefully disguised in the records. They were called mere Egyptians or Thebans or Memphites, anything to sever their connection to being Cushites or Ethiopians.
So the very term Egyptian was hijacked.
It was. It was hijacked by the conquerors to apply only to themselves and the mixed-race population, ensuring the original black founders were written out of their own history. It's erasure by classification.
That is just profound. Not only sealing the land, but
were-
creating a mechanism to steal the heritage itself.
And that brings us to the second equally destructive tool, what Williams calls the mulatto wedge.
The mulatto wedge.
Yes. By giving these mixed Afro-Asian or colored groups privileges and a higher social status over unmixed blacks, the conquerors created deep mutual suspicion and hatred within the race. They engineered a separate class that identified more with the conqueror than with their own black kin.
A structural division designed to guarantee permanent disunity.
Exactly. Williams points out that this same strategy was used successfully all over the world, in South Africa, later in the Sudan, always to maintain white power by making sure the black population was perpetually divided against itself.
Okay, let's look at that pivotal moment of unification. The Black King, Manes, unified the two lands, the Asian-influenced North and the African South. On the surface, that sounds like a positive act of integration.
It was a moment of triumph for Manes, yes, but it was seen as a deep betrayal by the southern blacks, those living below the First Cataract.
Right.
Because they had been watching this relentless Asian push southward, and they concluded that the invaders' goal was nothing less than the total control of all of Ethiopia. They saw Manes's integration policies as a dangerous, fatal concession.
So instead of staying and fighting for Lower Egypt, they made a strategic retreat.
A massive one. This loss of faith in their own black kings led to these huge, purposeful, and importantly, voluntary migrations southward. Williams stresses this point. The black withdrawal from Lower Egypt is the crucial key to understanding the whole history. They weren't just defeated. They actively rejected integration and deliberately migrated away to preserve their culture in the deeper African heartland.
So the history of Egypt, in his view, isn't the story of one empire, but the story of a culture in retreat.
Correct. It's the story of an ancient black civilization retreating from constant invasion.
Now we get to a part of the diagnosis that is, well, just tragic. The environmental pressures that seem to work in concert with the invaders. He calls this section, Nature Joins the Attack.
Yes. And this part really underscores how the history of the blacks was determined by physical factors. Climate, water, soil, maybe more than for any other people on Earth. The slow, relentless shrinking of inhabitable land over centuries left Africa with these vast areas of desolation, which just compounded the pressure from invaders.
And the single biggest force was the expansion of the Sahara Desert.
The scale of it is just hard to comprehend. We're talking about a 3 million square mile wasteland expanding. This process, desiccation, the relentless drying up of rivers and lakes, it literally buried once great cities and forced millions of people into mass movements. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow-motion ecological war.
And he notes some really devastating consequences of this on the population itself.
He does. He describes how this extreme drying up led to, well, hunger-crazed people in some areas descending into semi-barbarism, even cannibalism. And critically, he notes that millions of babies were likely physically and mentally retarded because of the extreme malnutrition.
So he's arguing for a real biological consequence of the environmental catastrophe.
Yes, a tragic inferiority, in fact, among parts of the population caused by the environment. It's a crucial point that separates his work from those who only focus on politics or war.
It's just a picture of constant, agonizing pressure. But then geography played one more terrible trick, this one on the Nile River itself.
This is what Williams calls the Nile's tragic joke. The entire continent is essentially a vast, inclined plain that slopes northward. The highlands, where the great rivers start, are in Central Africa, and the major rivers, including the Nile, all flow in the same direction.
Away from the African heartland.
Away from the heartland and toward the Mediterranean Sea.
And why does that geographic detail matter so much for the history of conquest?
Because it made the earliest, wealthiest centers of Black civilization, which were all in the north along the Nile, maximally vulnerable to northern invaders. The Nile, instead of flowing toward the majority of the continent's people where they could defend it, acted like a wide-open highway for conquest, delivering invaders directly to the seat of power.
The artery of life was also the invasion route. This leads us right into the fateful migrations, the human response to all this pressure.
And Williams argues that the direction of these migrations is the single great tragedy of the historical Black response. When they were forced out of Egypt, they made a profound error. Instead of moving en masse to the coastlines, which they could have defended,
They fled inward.
they fled toward the interior, to the remaining oases, then further south, central, and west. They chose isolation over defending their access to the world.
And the consequences of that isolation were catastrophic.
Absolutely. By surrendering the seaboards to Asians and mulattoes, often without a final, decisive fight, they sealed their own fate. They cut themselves off from world commerce and became, in Williams's stark words, a surrounded, hemmed-in hunting ground for slaves.
He notes that the whites were relentlessly aggressive, while the blacks had more of a brotherhood approach, a kind of meekness.
Yes, an attitude that, in a competitive world, was basically a tacit surrender.
And these migrations also had a terrible internal effect, creating the very condition that conquerors love to exploit: fragmentation and disunity.
This is the central recurring internal problem. The widespread movement led to continuous segmentation, the splitting up of groups into countless smaller societies. They became isolated from each other, which led to suspicion, hatred, and endless tribal wars over shrinking resources. It also caused a proliferation of different languages and dialects, which shattered any sense of a unified spirit.
The continuous splitting up made it impossible for outsiders to even classify them.
It was a direct result of the geography and the sociological response. Williams argues that this constant fragmentation was the main internal factor in the destruction of the great African states. The Asians and Europeans simply saw this continent-wide disunity and capitalized on it.
This is where it gets really interesting, though, because despite all this fragmentation, Williams's research uncovered something surprising, a continent-wide finding.
Yes. A single constitutional system and similar fundamental institutions, social, economic, religious, prevailed across virtually all of Black Africa. This points to an original, powerful basis for unity that was deeply embedded in the culture.
A uniformity that counters the idea of innate chaos.
Exactly. He traced this uniformity through customary law, finding common patterns in things like the age grade system, lineage ties, and land tenure across all 105 language groups he studied. This framework is the source of what he calls African democracy.
Okay, let's define African democracy as Williams saw it. He says it was born in chiefless societies. What does that mean?
Well, these chiefless societies weren't anarchic. They were self-governing states where the idea that the people are sovereign was considered as natural as breathing. This indigenous democracy was at its purest, where governance was managed without centralized, despotic chiefs.
And this idea of sovereignty defined the whole philosophy of power as leadership, not rulership.
Absolutely. The king or chief wasn't a despot. They were elected representatives, instruments of the people's will. Their power didn't come from the Constitution itself, but often from a spiritual role as a high priest. But the actual political power was held by the Council of Elders?
And there were constitutional checks on the leader's power.
Oh, stringent ones. The Council of Elders was the center of power. When they were debating, the chief or king had to remain completely silent. He couldn't speak until they reached a decision.
That's a powerful check.
It is. And furthermore, laws were always issued in the name of the people via an official called the speaker or linguist.
So the linguist was crucial. He spoke for the collective, preventing the king from issuing personal decrees.
Precisely. It ensured the head of state's voice was seen as the voice of the people. And this democratic ideal extended right to the core economic system, especially land tenure.
Williams identifies this as a fundamental difference from Western systems.
It's the fundamental difference. Land belonged to no single individual. It was God's gift, a sacred heritage held in trust for future generations. Therefore, land could not be sold, leased, or given away to outsiders.
So the chief's role was just as a custodian.
Strictly as a custodian, a trustee, ensuring fair distribution and use. When Africans said the king owned all the land, they meant he had the power to carry out the people's will as its steward, not that he possessed it privately.
This communalism must have provided incredible social security. What about individual rights?
The rights were detailed and protected. The right to petition grievances, to criticize authorities openly, and the guarantee of community care in case of sickness. The core economic principle was, the trouble of one is the trouble of all. No one could go in want while others had anything to give.
But the most crucial right, which ironically led to so much fracture, was the right of dissent.
Yes, the ultimate constitutional safety valve, the right to withdraw from the community unmolested. If a group couldn't accept a decision, they could just splinter off and form a new state. Williams points out that this right, while democratic, is one of the main constitutional reasons for the massive number of small societies across the continent. It was a flaw that geography and external enemies exploited ruthlessly.
That flaw, combined with the segmentation we talked about, really explains the disunity. And to maintain all this, they had a comprehensive educational system, the age grades.
The age grade system was absolutely fundamental to the Constitution. It wasn't just a social club. It was a comprehensive social, economic, political, and military structure that dictated everyone's responsibility.
Walk us through the curriculum. How did it train children?
It was intensely practical. Primary education for kids around 6 or 7 focused on core life skills, storytelling, mental arithmetic, community songs, and learning about local plants and animals, especially how to identify poisonous snakes and evade dangerous animals. Survival was mandatory.
A very practical education.
Yeah.
What about the advanced stage?
Advanced education for teenagers from 13 to 18 was extensive. They had to memorize family history, regional geography, military tactics, and complex bartering skills. Success at this level determined your future role in the age grade system. The craft guilds, the fighting forces, the advisors, and finally, the Council of Elders.
It's a complete system designed to integrate every single citizen into the life of the nation from childhood.
Exactly. It's powerful evidence of the sophisticated structures that Williams found.
So we've established the internal strength of these societies. Now we have to confront the external forces that destroyed them, often by exploiting those very internal flaws. Let's talk about the conquest by religion.
Williams found that Africans were, well, easy targets for conversion to both Islam and Christianity because they were already a highly religious people. They believed in one supreme God long before Abraham, so the new cults were easy to accept.
But the real aim of conversion, he argues, wasn't spiritual.
Not at all. The cloak of religion was a convenient hiding place for those with other designs. The real objective was changing the African into the white man's image, his ideas, his value system. This process led millions of Africans to become effectively non-Africans.
And the cultural consequence of that was?
They disavowed their entire native culture. They saw their own African institutions as backward or savage. Williams calls this the supreme triumph of the white world over the black, achieving self-worth only by becoming Muslims or Christians, which meant rejecting their original heritage.
This cultural warfare then paved the way for direct exploitation through slavery and the trade weapon.
Yes. The trade escalated dramatically when African kings began selling captured prisoners of war to Arabs. Williams stresses that when selling people for profit became the main source of wealth, it fatally undermined the sense of kinship. The leaders betrayed the core principle, the trouble of one is the trouble of all.
And the Arabs and Berbers understood that controlling economic choke points was the key to collapsing great states like Ghana.
Precisely. The raids on the caravan trails were relentless. These trails were the economic lifelines. The attacks crippled the stability of these states, leading to famine, internal tension, and collapse. They knew weakening the states internally had to come before any military push.
And here we see that tragic pattern again, the mulatto wedge, with the development of Afro-Arabs.
The historical pattern is just relentless. Afro-Arabs' mixed-race populations formed new identity groups that saw themselves as superior to unmixed blacks. They often spearheaded slave raids or became loyal agents for the invaders, repeating the exact process seen earlier in Egypt.
This identity confusion just fractured the black world even more, didn't it?
Fundamentally, in the Sudan, the Afro-Arabs bitterly resented being called Sudanese, which means black. Williams even saw unmixed, jet-black Africans who spoke Arabic insisting on being classed as Arabs, adopting the conqueror's identity for status. It just severely diluted any political unity.
If we look back even earlier, to Meroe in Ethiopia, Williams highlights a crucial self-inflicted wound, the technology gap with the iron industry.
This is one of the most sobering lessons. In Meroe, iron ore was abundant, they knew how to smelt it, but they failed to rapidly exploit it, especially for military weapons, at a time when their neighbors were becoming more advanced.
And the consequence was swift.
And devastating. It allowed the Assyrians, who were armed with superior iron weapons, to conquer them in 590 BC. They invaded the heartland, destroyed the holy city of Napata. The heartland was lost.
Why, though? Why didn't they prioritize military iron production?
He suggests that prosperity may have blurred their vision. They were incredibly successful in foreign trade gold, ivory, copper. This might have led them to see large-scale iron use as economically unsound compared to the profits from gold. Plus, iron production was often a royal monopoly, which restricted its widespread use for defense by the general population.
So reliance on commercial wealth, plus a monopoly on key technology, made the whole nation vulnerable.
Exactly. The lesson is chilling. Relying on trade instead of military self-sufficiency meant their prosperity became the very source of their vulnerability.
To bring this all to life, Williams provides detailed case studies in collapse. Let's look first at the Mossi Kingdom, which was an example of long-term resistance.
The Mossis are cited as an extraordinary example of organizational strength. They endured for over 500 years. They were a military powerhouse so strong that great empires like Mali and Songhai were never able to conquer them.
What was their secret? 500 years is a long time.
Their survival rested on a strict, resolute policy of excluding whites or rigidly limiting the number of foreign traders and controlling their activities. The historical record is clear. African states that were prosperous remained sovereign as long as they barred the aggressive whites from their territories.
And they held on to their own religion and institutions.
Steadfastly. They avoided that conversion-driven cultural erosion. They were entirely self-sufficient, managing their own caravan routes, levying their own taxes, but their end came when the European powers adopted a strategy Williams calls the war of attrition.
The economic attack before the military one.
Yes. The Europeans deliberately destroyed their great international caravan routes, plunging the country into economic panic and famine. Only after the society's economic fabric was destroyed did the final military conquest come. The kingdom fell to the French in 1896.
And their collapse tragically fulfilled a prophecy.
It did. The great prophecy of the Mossi said, "When the first white man appears in the land, the nation will die." Williams sees this as a symbolic prophecy for all African nations that let down their guard.
The Cuba Kingdom presents a different but equally important lesson about how internal politics can weaken a society from within.
Cuba is like a microcosm of the whole African experience, high achievement mixed with destructive internal imperialism. The Bashun leadership made remarkable strides in achieving unity. They deliberately incorporated the best arts and skills of all 18 constituent tribes into the national culture, making every success a national source of pride.
But that unity eventually gave way to autocracy by consent. How did their democratic structure fall apart?
Internal strife and rebellions were seen as such a profound threat to survival that the chiefs and the people made a radical choice. They voluntarily transferred massive, unprecedented powers to King Shiam around 1640, transforming the state from a democracy back into an absolute monarchy.
So this wasn't an external coup. It was an emergency transfer of power by the people to restore peace at the cost of democracy.
It's a critical lesson Williams wants you to absorb. Africans made mistakes too. This is a clear example of Africans destroying their own democratic institutions from within long before the Europeans arrived to finish the job.
And what was Cuba's repeated mistake when it came to external contact?
They were relatively secure as long as they maintained isolation, but eventually they abandoned that policy and allowed European traders and missionaries to set up outposts on their borders. It was the same fatal error made by the Mossi and others.
And the strategy was the same.
The same playbook. The Europeans ringed the country with trading posts. Missionaries followed, then armed guards. They used the same war of attrition strategy: destroy the caravan routes, create economic panic, and then the final military takeover.
Now we step back from the history and look at Williams's summary of the modern situation. This is his view from the bridge, the master plan. He's not subtle here.
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Williams argues that the so-called African independence of the mid-20th century was one of the greatest misconceptions of modern times. He states that colonialism never ended, it just transformed into an economic system of control.
He rejects the term neocolonialism.
He does. He sees it as the same old colonialism, just operating under the flags of independent nations. Colonialism was always about economic exploitation. That economic control is still there. The vast mineral resources of Africa, the gold, the diamonds, the black nations, neither own nor control the wealth of their own land.
Which prevents any real rebuilding.
Yes. They are systematically blocked because their trade is controlled by the same Western powers whose industries depend on shipping those raw materials out of Africa, keeping the African nations perpetually dependent and poor.
And this brings the focus back to the core problem for the diaspora worldwide, the black world at the crossroads.
The central problem for blacks everywhere, especially black Americans, is a profound and destructive lack of unity. This mirrors the historical fragmentation we saw in Africa. The thousands of independent black organizations all vying for leadership is the same self-defeating pattern that led to the downfall of the race historically.
Williams insists that before any progress can be made, the first hurdle is a mental revolution. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It requires accepting a stark reality he draws from history, that white America, as a collective system, is the enemy of black advancement, and that blacks will only ever be seen in a subordinate role until they command tangible, organized power.
So the goal has to be an acceptance of that rejection, which then leads to self-organization.
Exactly. Blacks must accept the harsh fact that they are rejected in the context of true equality and begin to reorganize for a position of self-sufficient power that commands respect, not one that is merely seeking the love or acceptance of the oppressor.
This is a direct rejection of integration as the primary strategy.
A forceful one. Williams stresses that blacks will remain weak until they begin the integration of blacks, first of all, unity among themselves, instead of fighting for amalgamation with whites who universally oppose real equality. He says the white world sees real black unity as a major threat, and so it consistently supports black leaders, the Negro elite, who pursue integration over self-sufficient organizations.
So his history leads directly to a prescriptive solution, which he lays out as the master plan structure. What does this plan for racial organization actually look like?
He proposes a massive, unified, nationwide organization for the race built around functional divisions that prioritize economic self-sufficiency. It's meant to be a practical starting point, not just a theory.
Let's start with the economic cornerstone.
The primary division is economic planning and development. The focus is entirely on communal ownership and cooperatives, built block by block. It's not about individual wealth, it's about collective capital. This includes creating a consortium of banks, widespread credit unions, and a central national bank for the organization itself to safeguard the financial resources of the entire race.
This moves into actual production, generating wealth, which requires technical expertise addressing that failure at Moreau.
That's the job of the Institute of Technology and Personnel Training. It's a dedicated program to train experts for large-scale manufacturing producing essentials like shoes, clothes, canned foods, furniture. Williams says this is crucial because the entire external system is structured to inhibit the potential of black people. This institute is designed to overcome that.
And what about social welfare, the kind of communal support we saw in the traditional African constitution?
That falls under the Division of Community Services. It covers things like health and sanitation, home nurse services, community clinics. It also houses legal aid services and, crucially, a division of youth activities, giving young people real leadership roles, mirroring that old age grade structure.
And finally, connecting the black world globally through the Division of Pan-African Affairs.
This division is designed to turn the idea of Pan-Africanism into action, to move beyond slogans. It's about maintaining direct contact and relationships with the people of Black Africa, the Caribbean, and other Black populations. The goal is counseling together, sharing progress, and most importantly, moving into direct action through the exchange of goods, services, and technical expertise.
So this comprehensive approach suggests he believed political protest alone was completely insufficient.
Insufficient unless backed by a self-sufficient, unified economic and technological power structure that the white world could not control. That's the ultimate conclusion of his entire historical analysis. Political freedom means nothing without economic control.
We've examined Chancellor Williams's meticulous study, a project spanning 16 years and 6,500 years of history. We've seen that the destruction of African civilization was this long, complex process rooted in geographic pressures, constant foreign invasion, and, so critically, deep internal disunity.
And the crucial lesson that Williams wants you, the listener, to internalize is that this knowledge has to lead to application. The history shows exactly where the race was strong, in its constitutional democracy and its economic communalism, and where it was tragically vulnerable in its fragmentation, its reliance on foreign trade, and its failure to prioritize military and economic self-sufficiency.
It's a painful but necessary look at the past, designed specifically to inform action in the present.
Which really raises an important question for you to consider. In a world where Williams states that the white man's phenomenal success, their position of strength, was derived historically from conquest and controlling the wealth of others, and that this success leads them to believe they are the superior people and rightful rulers of the planet. What specific action beyond political protest or just relying on empty slogans is necessary to create that unified, self-sufficient foundation of power outlined in the master plan? The kind of power that truly commands respect, not love, and assures survival.
That is certainly a powerful thought for you to explore as you process this history. We thank you for listening, and we hope this conversation inspires you to explore Chancellor Williams's complex history further. We would encourage you to go out and purchase his monumental book and support the author.
Consider subscribing for future content where we will continue to explore other monumental works of history and social analysis. Until next time.